Peter Petrelli stands at the top of a building and jumps from it, hoping to activate his flight powers. However, this was just a dream, and he's shown to be a nurse looking after an old man named Mr. DeVore. Then he has an awkward moment with his patient's daughter, Simone, after which they defuse the situation. Now we see a professor named Mohinder Suresh during one of his lectures, where he talks about the wonders of evolution and the immense possibilities associated with it. Unfortunately, he's interrupted by his colleague Nirad, who tells him his father Chandra has died in a car accident. Mohinder is devastated to hear this, but is also adamant about continuing his dad's research on Project Genesis, a mission to find humans with superpowers. Mohinder notices that some of Chandra's research has been stolen, so he decides to go to Queens in New York because that was where Chandra had traced patient 0. Now we meet Nikki Sanders, who fails to negotiate some extra cash from her online fans, and then we learn that she's doing this only to pay for her son Micah's education. Nikki suffers a brief moment of panic when she can't find Micah, and then things get worse when they have to run away from some goons who have come to extract the money she's borrowed from them. Next we meet Claire Bennett, who gets her friend Zach to record her jumping off a building and recovering from her broken bones during her 6th such attempt. We then see Peter meeting his brother Nathan, who's running for Congress. He tells him about the dream he had, but Nathan doesn't give it much thought as he focuses on his campaign. They have an argument, but then their mum Angela calls to let them know she's been arrested for shoplifting. Meantime, Claire freaks out over her powers of recovery, and Zach tries to console her, but to no avail. Now, a man in Japan named Hiro Nakamura manages to reverse time by 1 second and tells his friend Endo about it, but his boss takes him back to work, and then we see that Endo is one of Nikki's fans. Meanwhile, Nikki learns that her checks have bounced, so she has to withdraw Micah from school, and it leads to an ugly encounter with the principal. We also find out that she has an alter ego that she's trying to avoid. Peter and Nathan meet Angela, and Nathan acts very cold towards her, but Peter is more sensitive as he knows that Angela had lost her husband recently. She says that she stole socks just to feel alive, and Peter tells her about his supposed superpowers, but she doesn't believe him. Now, Nikki goes to her friend in order to keep Micah with her, and that's when we learn that she's borrowed money from a local gangster named Lindemann. Later, Claire enters a burning building to see if the flames can hurt her and ends up saving a man. The firefighters try to protect her from the fire but are shocked to notice that she has no burns. Now, Mohinder comes to New York and takes his dad's apartment to pick up from where he left off. Then we meet Isaac, an artist who can paint the future. However, he hates that he can predict accidents and destroys his paintings as he considers them to be omens. His girlfriend is revealed to be Simone, and she offers support, but he asks her to leave instead. Later, Nathan asks Peter to help him with his campaign by offering him a job, but they get into an argument regarding their priorities, and Peter goes away. He gets into Mohinder's cab, and they talk about how some people are special while others aren't. When we go back to Nikki, she is kidnapped and harassed by Lindemann's goons, but she resists them and ends up getting punched. Meanwhile, Hiro chills with Endo, and then they go to a karaoke bar. They talk about superheroes, and Hiro maintains that he can bend the space-time continuum, so Endo challenges him to teleport into the women's washroom. After some time, Nikki wakes up and is shocked to see the dead goons in the room, after which she realizes that this is the work of her alter ego. Now Peter gets off the cab, and then a man named Noah Bennett gets inside. He acts normally at first, but then he identifies with Mohinder, so he quickly runs away fearing the worst. Then Claire tries to tell her mom about her powers, but her efforts fall on deaf ears. In a hilarious sequence, Hiro is thrown out of the bar because he actually teleported into the ladies' washroom, and he proudly celebrates his achievement in front of Ando. Claire avoids exposing her powers to her mom when her hand gets stuck in the dishwasher, and then she says that she wants to meet her biological parents. She meets her father after this, and he's revealed to be Noah. Hiro wants to test his powers, so he gives it everything and manages to transport himself to New York. Later, Simone and Peter find Isaac, who's overdosed and is barely conscious. Peter notices a painting of him flying and is even more intrigued, so he calls Nathan to an alley. Peter tries to prove his point by jumping off a building, and then we see that Nathan is the one who can fly. He tries to save Peter, but he loses his grip and Peter drops down. he wakes up in hospital and doesn't remember anything. So Nathan tells him that he tried to kill himself. Then Claire talks to Noah about meeting her real parents and he asks her to chill for now as she's still quite young. Meanwhile, Mohinder finds an exterminator in his apartment but identifies him as an armed goon who's come to steal his father's research. Mohinder confronts him and then they bump into a woman named Eden in the middle of their struggle. Eden gets the gun and both men try to prove their innocence to her. Luckily, she spots the assassin's holster, thus prompting him to run away. Mohinder thanks her and then she realizes he's Chandra's son, as if she was his neighbor. Hero explores New York and spots a comic book that is based on his life. He wants to buy it but only has Japanese yen with him, so he steals the comic and runs away. Upon further inspection, he learns that Isaac is the writer of the comic and notes down his address. Then Isaac tells Simone that he needs to alert the authorities on a vision he had about a nuclear explosion, but she says that she's got too much on her plate and can't afford to lose him to drugs. Meanwhile, Zach tries to warn Claire about something, but then she's summoned by her principal. Nikki panics and runs away from the murder scene with a camera that had recorded everything in the room. She goes through the footage, but it blurs out when she's attacked, and then she becomes unconscious for 4 hours, after which she wakes up in new clothes. Nikki gets mica from her friend and figures that she needs to cover her tracks as Lindemann will be after her now. Later, Mohinder and Eden talk about his dad and the memories they've each shared with him. Realizing that Chandra had confided in Eden regarding his research, Mohinder asks her to share whatever he told her. Back at school, some cops want to find the girl who saved the fire victim and they identify Claire, but her friend Jackie coincidentally saves her by selfishly taking the credit for it. Zach finally gets to Claire and tells her that her power display tapes have gone missing. During this conversation, Claire is accidentally knocked down by her classmate Brody and snaps her neck, but manages to heal it quickly before anyone else can notice. Nikki comes home and sends Micah to take some supplies from his room, after which she checks the garage and finds everything cleaned up as well as a key to a new car. She realizes that her alter ego had taken over to complete this task and also finds a note in the car telling her to follow the map in the trunk. She's shocked to find the bodies inside it and figures her alter ego wants her to bury them. Peter is visited by Angela in hospital and she asks him why he jumped off the roof. After that, she tells him that his dad had actually died from suicide and he was suffering from severe depression. She also mentions that the condition is genetic and Peter can also have it, as his apparent delusions can be confirmed symptoms. Angela and Peter have an emotional conversation and she reveals that she can't lose him as he's her favorite son. Later, Hero goes to Isaac's house but finds him dead with his brain missing, and in a moment of panic, he picks up the murder weapon right when the cops arrive, so he's arrested immediately. Now we are introduced to a cop named Matt Parkman who guards the Walker family murder scene. He can hear the sounds of a little girl crying for help, so he goes inside the house to look for her. The investigators suspect the killer to be a maniac named Siler, judging from the way the victim's brains have been removed. Then Matt manages to find the missing girl whose name is Molly. She's scared at first, but Matt convinces her to come out of hiding as he's the good guy. While Mohinder and Eden look for more clues, they go through some of Chandra's voicemail messages. They come across a message from Siler, who is revealed to be Patient Zero, and then Eden helps Mohinder find a pen drive containing Chandra's method to locate the heroes. Meanwhile, Matt is questioned by an investigator named Audrey Henson about how he managed to find Molly on a hunch, and he's unable to come up with a suitable explanation. So Audrey places him under arrest as she suspects him to be the murderer. Now Nikki follows the map and finds a location where there are lots of dead bodies buried underground. Then Claire spends some time with Noah, who says he's going to help her find her real parents. However, he's also shown to be the man who stole Zach's camera, so now he knows his daughter's secret. Later, Peter confronts Nathan as he recalls the flying incident and threatens to jump again if he doesn't confess. Nathan eventually lets it out that both of them flew during the incident, but Peter doesn't believe him. That's when Nathan points out that he's floating in the air and Peter hugs his brother with relief. As Hero is being questioned, he asks the cops to call Ando in order to prove his innocence. However, when they contact him, he says that Hero's been missing for 5 weeks. Hero realizes that he traveled through time as well as space, but then he witnesses a nuclear explosion. Luckily, he manages to go back to the past before it reaches him. Noah drops Claire off at school and notices that his daughter has a crush on Brody. Now that he's back in Japan, Hero quickly meets Ando and shows him the comic that he brought from the future. He tries to explain everything that happened, but Ando doesn't take him seriously. So he promises to prove his point by using the comic, as it contains the entire storyline leading up to the explosion. Meanwhile, Peter tries to activate his flight powers multiple times but fails miserably in each of his attempts. That's when he learns about Chandra's research, so he tells Nathan about him. But his brother can't focus on anything else because he has to cover up the fact that Peter jumped off a building in plain sight. Mohinder loses out on sleep as he continues with his research, but it's of no avail and he becomes frustrated due to this. Eden tries to calm him down, but it only leads to Mohinder throwing away Chandra's laptop. However, this allows them to find a small diary hidden inside it, and the duo learns that it's connected to Siler, as it contains a key that they assume might lead to the serial killer. Now Matt is questioned by Audrey and he eventually confesses that he can hear people's thoughts. She doesn't believe it, so he proves himself and is offered to work for the FBI. Later, Simone meets Isaac and says that she wants to take him to rehab, but he refuses to comply as he believes it's his destiny to stop the nuclear explosion. Simone has had enough, so she leaves and breaks up with him. Hero tries to call Isaac to warn him about his death, but it's of no use as they face a language barrier. Then Hero decides to show Ando the accuracy of the comic when they go to save a little girl from getting hit by a school bus. Hero spots her and Ando tries to stop the bus, but this was actually what led to the accident in the first place. Luckily, Hero freezes time with his powers and saves the girl, thus finally convincing Ando about the comic. After Nikki buries the bodies, she finds a skeleton ring that reminds her of her criminal husband, DL. Then she takes Micah to his grandma Paulette, but she's met with hostility. Nikki maintains that DL is a murderer, but Paulette refuses to believe her, so she decides to leave with Micah. Meanwhile, Audrey tells Matt about Siler and his killing spree, after which he's taken to Molly. Then Mohinder and Eden use the key to break into Siler's apartment, where they find a secret passage that leads to a research room that is even more detailed than Chandra's. Mohinder panics when he finds a killing room, so he alerts the cops immediately. While this is going on, Matt and Audrey find Siler attacking Molly and manage to scare him away. Audrey goes after Siler and threatens to shoot him, but he uses his powers to control her and is about to make her shoot herself. Luckily, Matt drops by and attacks Siler, but he surprisingly gets up and flies away even after taking a lot of bullets. With no other option left, Ando and Hero decide to fly to America so that they can save Isaac. Meanwhile, Peter quits his job and it leads to a more personal conversation with Simone. At night, Claire enjoys a party with her classmates and bonds with Brody, who manages to land a kiss on her. Later, Matt goes back to his wife Janice, but they end up arguing, so he leaves. Brody forces himself on Claire and it leads to an accident where she's impaled on a tree log. Then we see Nikki being kidnapped by a cop who's on Lindeman's payroll. Peter and Simone reunite at Nathan's party and he says he's in love with her. However, things go south when Nathan publicly announces that Peter had attempted suicide. This ticks him off, so he leaves the room immediately. Meanwhile, Matt reads people's minds at a bar, but he can't get through one particular man and faints after that. Now we see Mohinder taking the cops to Siler's apartment, but it's been cleaned out, much to his surprise. Later, Peter punches Nathan for what he did, even though he tries to explain himself. Simone goes to console him and they end up kissing. However, Isaac had already predicted this and he gets depressed upon sensing it. The log is finally taken out of Claire's body, so she recovers, but she's shocked to find herself on an autopsy table. And that's the end of part 1. Like, share and subscribe if you want to see part 2 as soon as possible, and hit that bell icon to get notified when it happens. See you soon.